I think for us, the challenge that we ran into late last year was because we have like an all-in-one, we have different modules. So we were selling base plan for $3 and then each add-on for like $1 to $2. Then what we noticed is that on a sales call, the person was literally doing the math themselves, like, just pull out calculator and be like 3 plus 1. Yeah. Then we realized that we have to do bundling. And then first time for me to think deeply into like, how do I do pricing? And I was having a lot of struggle as well to be like, but I see customers that want this and that. How do I build a plan that fit everyone?
Welcome to The First Podcast. I'm your host, Alex Rankin. On today's episode of The First, we sit down with Brian Ip, who made the leap from investment banking to founding Omni HR, a regional HR tech platform transforming how companies across Asia manage their workforce. From Wall Street to launching a regional HR tech platform in Asia, Brian shares how he traded spreadsheets for startup chaos, navigated a crowded market with clarity, and built conviction through countless moments of doubt. If you're an early-stage founder learning to trust your instincts while everything feels uncertain, Brian's journey will resonate deeply. Let's dive into the conversation with Brian of Omni HR. Brian, welcome to The First Podcast.
Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So maybe just for the audience, can you give a little bit of a primer as to what Omni exactly is, what kind of platform it is, where it's based, customers, etc.?
Sure. Yeah. So Omni HR is an all-in-one HR platform. We help companies to really automate the end-to-end employee process from onboarding to offboarding in one place. What we are trying to solve is, a lot of the traditional HR systems in the market focus very much on the administrative functions like payroll and all that. But when it comes to employee management, even performance reviews, workflow automation, they have always been neglected. And essentially what we are trying to do is something that is, all-in-one, easy to use, easy to, just automate, give good data analytics for the clients. And also at the same time, we provide, something that is flexible enough to support regional workforce as well. Because nowadays, a lot of companies have regional presence. And, traditionally, a lot of these systems have been built with a single siloed country in mind. Yeah.
Great. So I think let's start from the very beginning. And I have to be honest here. I always do a whole bunch of background research on every guest that comes on the show. And I have to say that you were far more trickier than most guests. Like usually when I...
a limited online presence.
Yeah, limited online presence. So maybe let's start from, upbringing, where you were brought up, etc.
Yeah, sure. So I was born and raised in Hong Kong, has been there probably until I was like age 17, 18, then moved to the US for my undergraduate degree, studied in the US, and then I started working in finance and investment banking in the US. Worked there for a year, and then eventually, because of work visa issues, there's an H-1B visa application process with a lottery draw.
The bane of many people's existence. Yeah,
exactly. So then I moved from US to UK for another year, and I eventually moved back to Hong Kong, where my hometown is, and then I did finance for a few more years. And then eventually, right around the COVID time, I thought, I wanted to try something different, and I thought that was the right timing for me to do so. And therefore, I left finance investment and then moved on to become a founder. Yeah.
Growing up, was there entrepreneurial spirit around you? Was there things that early on were starting to give you a sense that maybe you wanted to be a founder one day?
Yeah, sure. I think growing up, I always know that I want to build something one day. I see that in myself. Actually born in a relatively traditional background. Both of my parents are like accountants. They didn't really think of me being an entrepreneur. But just growing up, I always feel like maybe someday I want to build something. So that has always been on my mind. Before Omni, I've done a few like small experiment gigs here and there as well.
And did your parents study overseas? Like, was it always in the plan, or you sort of realized at some point you wanted to have more global experience to go pursue your undergrad offshore?
Sure. I think I always know that. And I have a brother, and I can't follow his footsteps as well. So we kind of always know that I want to go, somewhere international eventually.
Yeah. Okay. And so you jumped into investment banking. That was just the path that everyone followed, or was it part of a master strategic plan?
That's a plan that I think a lot of people want to follow, and I think I work pretty hard towards that goal as well. And back then there was a time when I feel like it's something that is interesting. Before I actually moved into banking, I thought investment banking is about like trading stocks, and then I studied finance in school and be like, oh, actually it's about corporate finance, and actually a lot of like M&As, IPOs. Those are actually really interesting projects to work on.
Yeah. I
was always amazed by like all these M&A deals that got announced in the news, and when I realized that there's actually a path in Korea that I can actually do that was pretty interesting for me. So then that's why I decided I wanted to try really hard to get into investment banking.
And I guess the follow-up question is, when did you realize you wanted to leave investment banking? Was that within within the first week, or was it, look, you did your 2 years and you thought
Yeah, no, I think I still enjoy a lot of the investment banking work. I think I learned so much, about business, like how to run a business from my finance background.
Yeah.
Investment banking, you get to understand like the metrics, you get to understand how do you craft the investment story. I pick up so much from investment. I think just along the process in career, I realized I probably, I guess like over time, I want to do like different stuff. So like, when I was on the investment banking, so-called the sell side, trying to advise companies, I realized that I want to be an investor. So that's why I moved to become on the buy side, joining a fund and trying to deploy, money to do investment. And then over time, I realized that maybe I wanted to be a founder so that I can experience building something myself instead of just deploying and then, relying on someone's execution. I want to try execution myself as well.
What I find interesting about that is, you've had this really, really impressive kind of career already in IB, and you went US and you also in London, right? Was there like this kind of urge to stay in the US or in London and kind of fulfill this career out? Because obviously we know now that you came back into Hong Kong and you went to Generation Capital, which we can touch on. But was there this, urge from you to kind of traject into a corporate career into the US?
I don't know. I haven't really thought too much about it. I think probably I have to leave before I get to know too much about what I want in my career.
Yeah.
But I think overall, I would say with all things considered, I think it worked out to be a pretty interesting path for me. I get to explore, experience, the finance, work in both, US and UK. So I thought that was something that is quite unique on my resume. I think also overall it works out quite well, but I haven't really put a lot of thought, if I were, to stay in US for a longer time.
And then you obviously came back into Hong Kong with Generation Capital. How did that all come about?
Sure. Yeah, I think back then I wanted to try buy-side investment, which is basically deploying capital, investing in companies. And Generation Capital was a new fund that was set up back then. They were deploying very actively in tech, in TMT. And that was something that I thought, is interesting. That was also the time when tech, especially consumer tech, internet is very popular. So I get to see a lot of like the so-called, the next generation of like fast-growing, consumer tech companies around, the Asia region. And that's where I get to learn a lot about like, more I guess from a mindset of investors, what would they look at? Like, how do they look at like unit economics, whether it's path to profitability when I'm looking at a Series C startup? What does investors want to look at? So that's where I learned a lot of those. And eventually, I think I reached a point where I feel like looking at like B2C consumer tech doesn't give me a lot of edge per se, because every company would have a lot of numbers, but in a world of B2C, consumer tech, things can just change so fast. Economics, a business model that has been working for the last 12 months may not work going forward, and vice versa. So a lot of time it comes down to really the founders, your judgment on the founders. So I was trying to find something that, how can I build up my own barrier? How can I build up my edge in something? And that was when I realized maybe there's a B2B tech and there's fintech that I think there are more substance, more like, just barrier in the industry. And that's why I then move on to do more on the B2B investment side.
It's an interesting observation, because I can imagine that being based in Hong Kong at the period you were with Generation, you were inevitably looking a lot at mainland China, and at that point China was still probably deep into its trajectory curve that was positive. Maybe moving into B2B was actually a little bit contrarian in some ways, right?
Yep.
Because a lot of people would have said that B2C is this gold mine in China.
Yep.
Do you think it's sort of, with retrospect, you have those observations, or at the time it was, you were like, this is not going to end positively and there's a lot of money going into sectors that may not actually yield long term?
You mean in the B2B side? Or
in the B2C side?
In the B2C side, got it. I think I think I definitely experienced probably the most interesting years in B2C tech back in China. We as Generation, we look at companies like Meituan, we were investing in it and all that. So we get to see a lot of those very interesting new business model that has been growing very rapidly. I think when I left Generation and moved on to the investment team within Goldman Sachs to do B2B investment, I think probably for the first 6 months, 12 months, I do feel like it's probably a bit of a contrarian view to do B2B. But I think over time, time has actually proven that was maybe the right shift as well. Because in China or in Asia, I think people then start realizing there's actually a certain ceiling in a lot of this business model, and a lot of times you have to really burn a lot, and you don't know where that sustainable unit economics would come eventually. So there's a lot, there's a shift in investment sentiment as well towards B2B over time. So that's where I feel like what I probably have made the decision in the right way, because then we see that B2B tech then get picked up a lot during the time of like 2019, around that the period as well.
Yeah, sure.
So at a high level, it's B2B and there's an interest there. I guess the question for me is like, why did you start to lock in on specifically HR tech at this time? Were you exposed to that? And why did you deep dive in there?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think the first time when I actually came across HR tech when I was in investment, I hated that transaction a lot. I have very little interest or understanding about HR tech, and I was like, what are these, like all these different modules? Like, what is an ATS? What is this and that? But I think like over time when I start learning, and I told myself that B2B is something that I want to really study and learn. That's when I start realizing like how I think like then I start appreciating a lot of like the different B2B like segment, like, or like verticals within the B2B business. And that's when I realized HR tech is actually something that is very interesting. I think maybe I guess to kind of sidetrack or to extend it a bit on like why I think Omni and like how does doing B2B investment lead me to founding Omni is that I think HR tech is something that is so fundamental to every company. There's a shift in how employees are being treated in the company. They're a lot more of a company asset than the resources these days. And in what we are building as HRIS, there's such a localization element in this product that we think the winner eventually has to be in Asia. So when I was looking at HR tech, I realized that there's actually a lot of gaps in the market. A lot of the users were actually not very satisfied with what they have. They pick certain tools because that was the best in the market, but not really the best product comparing to a lot of the other best-in-class categories. So I think from that perspective, then I think over time I realized that I wanted to to learn a lot more about this industry and see like what is exactly this pain point. Why is the industry developed in such a way? So which is why then I think over time I pick up a lot more interest in learning HR tech and learning different categories of HR tech. Yeah.
So we speak to a lot of founders on the show that come from very great corporate careers, or they've come from lucrative roles in big tech, and they make the step into founding, right? I guess for you, were there any reservations in making that move? Because from an outsider looking in, you come from like what could be an incredible trajectory in the corporate side of things. Were you worried? Did you need validation from others, validations from maybe early customers, etc.?
I definitely do quite a bit of validation before I jump in, but I would say I kind of know that I wanted to be a founder at some point. That was very clear to me, even when I was like, even a few years back before I jumped. So I think that was very clear for me. There's always a question of like, when should I do that leap of faith? And like, that do take quite a bit of courage. So I think, COVID was actually a pretty important turning point, inflection point. I was like, it just makes me think a lot on like, what should I do with my life? When is the right timing? If I don't do it now, when would be the right time? So that was the time when I was like, maybe, the risk that I'm taking is not that big. There's always going to be a backup option for me somewhere if it doesn't work out. But I think that there's also, such a great learning experience for me. So that's why I did some validation. I talked to a lot of people. There's no MVP, but I just basically do a lot of like, calls and research. From my finance investment background, I also know how to do like expert calls, like talking to different industry, people. So I kind of see, use that a bit of skills to try to like understand a bit more on the problem statement. And then I feel like maybe there's something that I'm interested in and then I do it. Yeah.
I guess, one perspective early on could have been that HR tech was an early software category, right? So that there was quite a lot of crowding in the space. I guess outside in, it appears like there's many solutions. As in disclosure, we're an investor and a user of Omni. We love what you guys do. But that was also our observation. And then as your point, you dig in and you go, wow, this actually isn't really serving the market maybe as you would have thought. But notwithstanding that, there is a lot of noise. So, how did you get comfortable with that, early on?
Sure. I think it's probably a mix of conviction and just being naive. To be very honest, I think I always have a product mindset or product sense. So when I look at a lot of the existing solution, I was like, I know this is not good enough. I think I can do a 10x better product. That was like something that I always trust. I believe in my mind. But at the same time, being a first time founder back then, I know very little about exactly what does it mean to have so many competitors. Right? So that was probably that was that. But I think overall, I do believe that if I have the right resources and the time, I can build something that is a lot better than what was in the market. Yeah.
But I think that's almost, if I think back to other conversations we've had, that nice mix, right? Yeah. Of sort of like you have enough self-confidence that built up through your career thus far, but you don't know too much, because sometimes if you know too much, then there's that fear to jump.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
We ask all founders this, but do you remember specifically what day one at Omni was like?
I remember how the early period was like. I don't remember exactly that day one.
That's fine.
But yeah, no, a lot of just figuring things out. Building a product the first time, hiring a team the first time. Yeah, that was probably what it was. I remember the first time when before we started about like planning the product before we start talking to customers. And when we planned the product, I remember my product manager was talking to me, be like, "This is a waterfall approach. We should go with agile approach." I have no idea what that means. So a lot of this learning was like happening in that first 1 month or like a few weeks when I was just picking up so much and trying to learn like how do we manage these. Yeah.
How did you prioritize everything amongst the chaos? And did you decide, I guess, specifically, I need to fundraise first, I need to build first, I need to sell first? Like, how did you strategize around those big pillars?
It's always a really tough decision. I think even till now, I think in any startup, that resource allocation, prioritization is always the most difficult question.
Yep.
On hindsight, I think, we kind of know what product or MVP we want to build first. So we were quite focused on that. And obviously, I think in that journey, I would say I have, a lot of things I didn't know back then. I have made mistake. One of the mistake that I always share with other founders is that I would have started my marketing a lot earlier. For me, I was like, because we need a product to sell, it's a mature market, and was like, let's build a product, let's build the best product before we sell. So by the time we actually have a good product, the marketing funnel is not fully established yet. Or a lot of those are still, in the ramp up phase. So that was like a challenge that on hindsight I realized. But back then it was like, let's build a product and then let's try to fundraise a bit, and then you have the resources to keep building that product.
Who were the early customers of the platform? Like, who were those kind of early believers or adopters?
Yeah, I think obviously there are friends who, just come on board very early on. And then there was one referral from an investor as well who just introduced us. But back then we were just trying everything. Like, there was a conference in Singapore back then, and we were just reaching out to everyone we saw on the attendee list that has an HR background. And I remember like probably that was like my third or fourth customer. I met that person in a cafe. Initially she told me, and she flew in from the Philippines, and she told me that they have a system, they don't need it. And then after 1 hour of just casual conversation, I was not even trying to push very hard, but I just told like her what we can do and what is in the pipeline. And after the meeting, she actually said that, she actually wanted to, give it a try. And eventually she actually came on board as our third or fourth customer. But really, we just have to try everything we can,
Yeah, I mean, I love the kind of, doing the background research and even talking to Ben. And, we're obviously, as Ben mentioned, we're an Omni user. And it's interesting, like that whole Asia-centric approach, right? Like there is obviously a gap back then in terms of the software capabilities of Western incumbents. What are some of those examples? Like, what are some of the examples whereby those existing solutions just weren't relevant for the Asia customer?
I guess maybe I'll break down into two parts. I think one is that so within the system, in HR system, there are as you would imagine, like every country has their own employment rules, has their own payroll and all that. That has a lot of nuance that has to be customized. And this is not something that is as easy to roll out globally as something like, say, I don't know, a CRM, for example, because most companies would do a similar process in sales and marketing. But in HR and payroll, it's just, there's a lot of those nuances. That's probably why we see that it's almost a captive, demand in Asia, that eventually if we have something that can localize in each country that is good enough, then people would want to use this over, something that is, half baked, or you're not really giving that full suite solution. So that's probably what we see. The second part that I would say is that, ultimately what we want Omni to be like is not just an HR system. We see HR as where the starting point where we have the employee record. And when we look at like a employee life cycle or how company use a system, we see so much potential in other areas, within the company. If you think of an org chart, right, there's so many departments that actually tie back to the company, to the employee. And eventually we want to build almost an ecosystem. Either we have a module ourselves in those, or we plug into an existing player, and everything can be connected. And then Omni can become an employee control panel. So that's the vision that we see. And that's a vision that I believe right now, even globally, very few players are moving to that stance yet. And we believe that, if we can start off with something that is so localized and we build our edge, then eventually we can become, that ecosystem player.
What were the biggest challenges early on, I guess, both in scaling the product because you were trying to be multi-market from very early on, but also just generally in the business? Was it actually finding the talent because software is relatively nascent as a category in this part of the world?
Interesting. Sure. I think very interesting question. I think on the product side, or I think in our sector, like the go-to-market function tie very closely to the product, because as you mentioned, this is a relatively established market. People know what they want, so there's a very high baseline expectation actually, and I know, from, in my first 1 or 2 years when my product is not fully ready, I know even if I have pushed very hard on sales and marketing, it's not going to really move the needle until my product is up to a certain standard. So I think building a good product has always been something that is very, fundamental to what we do. At the same time, I think building a startup, obviously I think like team management, people management, those are all like very hard topics as well. I think in Asia, we see limitations in certain talent pool, I would say. Like, for example, especially in the B2B space. So finding good B2B talent in Asia, definitely the pool is not as deep as maybe some other parts of the world. Yeah.
I want to double click on what it means to be localized, because I truly understand the kind of Asia-centric mantra of Omni, and to capitalize on like weaknesses and, make something that's nuanced to this region. But like, I think of other companies, in this region, if you think of like, taking the commerce lens and look at Lazada and like how they tried to localize within each country. And I do want to ask the question around like, if you now look back, like what are some key tactics to actually localize to specific markets within Asia itself? Is it, hiring the right people, having the right leadership in those markets? Is it, tailoring to regulatory nuances? What are some of the most important things, do you think?
Sure. I think probably two parts. One is the product. So as you rightly mentioned, I think there's a lot of nuances in what people need to do in the system in Asia. Like CPF, for example, in Singapore is very different from other countries. So that definitely is something that is just a hard requirement that other systems cannot do, the global solutions cannot do, that we can do. The second part I would say is that when we were talking to a lot of people, and actually it's a feedback from one of our early customers, is that there's actually lacking a community in this region, like for HR leaders, for people to actually group, mingle, do knowledge sharing. And that's something that eventually we rolled out probably in our second year, is we wanted to build a community that allowed these people to bond together as well. So we want people to think of Omni as there's a product, but at the same time we want to provide a community, provide a space where people can just network. And usually in those settings, we don't pitch about the product. We just really want to provide a safe environment for people to just meet like-minded people. And that's something that if I look at it from a branding perspective, from a company perspective, that is something that is quite unique as well. I think globally there are a lot of successful products that also have a community and that eventually become a forum for people to exchange ideas and network. We wanted to have that element as well, and that really eventually would help us in the business side, but we also want to create something that is really genuinely helpful for the community.
I do want to gear shift here to competition, and if you think about this, the HR tech space, but in particular, you guys capitalizing on the Asia side of it. What have you seen more so since the inception of Omni? Have you seen more Western incumbents coming in and trying to localize their product or operations, or have you actually seen more kind of local and startups basically coming and trying to capitalize on this area?
Interesting. I think a few observations. I think one is that HRIS, HR information system as a category, is getting more popular globally. People see this, as I mentioned, as the source of employee data, and there's so many pieces that connect to it. People want to build employee cloud globally. So I think that's a trend that we see. There are emerging tech trying to build this in different parts of the world. Within Asia, I would say we haven't really seen a substantial change in the competitive landscape, but we definitely can see there are some competitors here and there that emerge. And a lot of times they would go through probably, I guess, similar challenges what we go through initially. There's just so much that you want to build. The expectation is just so much in the product, and as someone that I talked to before told me, like, for example, in payroll, building it is probably 20% of the work. Maintaining it and trying to keep it up is the 80%, right? So there's a lot of like those nuances that actually goes into the product as well.
I want to touch a little bit on the automation and workflow. I think one of the things that we were really impressed by and we thought was very thoughtful early on is a recognition of how much is required in the stack, and a really sort of deliberate motion around, this is what we're going to build and we're going to make core to us, and this is what we feel like either is commoditized or already well serviced and we better integrate. And I think that mindset 2 or 3 years ago is increasingly obvious today, but it was like a pretty insightful and had a lot of foresight in the decisions you guys made around product. How's that changed over time? And I guess, will you Is that the same approach that you adopt today? Has that evolved? How do you think the future of that will play out as we're seeing this paradigm shift around AI?
Yep. Interesting. Oh, around AI, interesting. So I think maybe firstly on the topic of integration, I guess like there are tools that we just know that is so fundamental to every company, especially like Slack, Teams, Calendar, those things that we know, people would need to have integration to this. And, also a lot of the incumbents cannot do those integrations. So that's a way that we wanted to really flesh out the automation that we have. In terms of, let's say, the other modules, so, we very clichély say we want to be an all-in-one system, right? And we know that we cannot be the best in everything. So ideally, we wanted to actually integrate with more, and we wanted to be, a good partner with other systems, and we can build an ecosystem around this. I think in Asia, what is, I guess a unique challenge is that a lot of companies really are looking for all-in-one, especially with a budget constraint. So in some way, even though we know we cannot be the best in class in, say, a ATS, a performance management system, we have to have a good enough layer or a bundle in our suite in order for people to see the value of this all-in-one in our system. And I think that is the preferred approach by a lot of companies in this region as well. And that ultimately, I believe that, there would be a segment of company, especially the enterprise company, which would use a lot of point solutions and prefer the integration. And, we can support that. At the same time, for us as an all-in-one system, we can provide maybe an 80%, good enough system in a lot of the other modules. And the power of all-in-one is where we get a lot of people to stick here.
Is that, I guess, the idea of building a magic product in this region? You talk about a product that when people see it, when they demo it, they go, wow, I just need to have this. I want to buy this out of anything else I've seen. Is magic in Asia, Asian sort of focused software, being comprehensive and all in one? Is that what people start to go? Or is it the intuitive nature of it? Is it the ease? Like, what really you think defines great product that sells well out in this region?
Understand. I think all-in-one is just one element of it. I think like probably there's always a functional element, and there's also a user experience element. So I think from a functional perspective, people do want an all-in-one. I have in the past talked to prospective customers who told me it's scary how much we can do in our product, and I take it as a compliment on how much we have. At the same time, I think like you cannot just have everything, but in a very traditional clunky way. We want it to be really something that's delightful. I am also quite judgmental on the product that we build. That I think right now we are not at that end of delightful yet. I think there's actually still a lot that we can do. That goes back to prioritization. But I hope that we can really build a great product that think in the user mindset, think about like the user experience. How can we craft that along with that functional in the system.
Yeah, right.
Now there's obviously a lot of early stage founders listening, and I do want to cater to them. So 2 questions. One is around MVP, and the second is around product market fit. When you guys were building out the MVP, how did you validate that? Whether that was through quantitative data or adoption data, qualitative. And then the second question is, how did you know when you had product market fit, or are you a believer in product market fit?
Okay, very interesting. And I think the situation is quite unique to our case as well. I don't think it applies to a lot of companies. When we were doing our MVP, our hypothesis was onboarding was something that is still manual in most companies in this region. And when we were first building this, that was back in 2021, we think, a lot of companies are hiring a lot and then they want to have the automation. And we see onboarding as the upstream to a lot of other things. Like that's where when we collect, the bank details, the payroll details, set up the time off policies and all that. So we thought if we do onboarding really well, then we can then trickle down to do a lot of the other downstream actions. And with that, we talk to a lot of companies and we see that, they can see the value in onboarding as well, especially for a lot of companies that were hiring a lot. But obviously things have shifted, after 6-12 months after we have launched the MVP product. So a lot of companies were not hiring as much, especially in the tech space back then. In fact, some of them are laying off quite a lot of people in a short period of time, right? And they're not going to look for an offboarding system per se. So I think I guess if I were to measure it from an MVP perspective, probably something that would have worked initially, but then it just doesn't really no longer work. But I guess what we still have was, I think there was a lot of like persistence and just stubbornness in our team that we believe in that vision. We know that it's going to be a lot of hard work. It's just a matter of time before we build different modules. So that's probably applied to us. I would say in a lot of other companies where the sector is not as established, maybe I would focus a lot more on how do I do demand generation instead of or market education instead of trying to figure out the right product. Like one of the things I mentioned, like, I wish I started my marketing earlier. We actually do SEO. I think today we do SEO quite well, but we started the SEO game, very late in this founder journey. And I always, have this belief that if we have started it from day one, we can just see so much search volume to see what people actually search for, and we can even just cater our product to what people are actually interested in finding out. So, for example, I think one of the articles that we have, a lot of, clicks and views is on setting up self goals and setting up how to write self performance review. Those could be very good way for us to get the lead gen, and then we can build a product according to that and just sell. So I see product market fit as, the market is probably a lot more important than the product is, and the market one really have to think ahead of time to see how to do the lead generation into the products. I also would say, sometimes that I think product is a math question. What I mean by this is if you have enough resources and enough time, you can figure it out. I think the go-to-market and market side is an essay, is an open-ended question. So even if you have enough resources, you may not be able to find the answer. So I would definitely focus on finding that market first and then figure out what to build the product later on.
I like that. That's interesting. Maybe shifting a little bit to pricing, particularly when you're wanting to build a product that's all in one and comprehensive, but you've got to start and sell. How did you guys think about pricing as a mechanism, and how's your thinking evolved over time, particularly in this market that you sell into?
I think we have certain principles that we follow, but also would say, from what I've also heard from other founders is that don't overthink the pricing too much. I think where we want to position ourselves was we want to be premium to the local players, but discount to the global players. So that gives us a spectrum of how much we want to price, and then we just go along with it. And at the same time, I think on our side, the billing side, we have, give out discount to our early customers and all that. And that was very messy at some point. And then we then have to eventually fix all of those. But, in the early stage, just roll it out and just see.
Sell.
Right? Yeah, and then just figure it out afterwards. Yeah.
Does pricing though adjust over time? Does that thought process, as the product architecture builds out and builds out and builds out, how do you guys think through that? Or is that just kind of qualitative feedback from your customers?
Yeah, so that's a very interesting question. I think for a lot of founders, they probably have maybe, one or, a handful of key products that they're selling, and probably that would be quite obvious how they want to bundle or to sell it. I think for us, the challenge that we ran into late last year was because we have an all-in-one, we have different modules. So we were selling base plan for $3 and then each add-on for $1 to $2. Then what we noticed is that on a sales call, the person was literally doing the math themselves, just well calculated, be 3 plus 1.
Carry the 3, drop the 6.
Yeah. So then that was then we realized that we have to do bundling. And then first time for me to think deeply into how do I do pricing.
Yeah.
And I was having a lot of struggle as well to be but I see customers that want this and that. How do I build a plan that fit everyone? And then eventually my team told me, we are not trying to fit everyone. We are trying to fit something that actually works for the company, and we want people to actually think in that way. So right now, for example, we have this tier where we will group in features that we think the audience would be benefiting from it, even though it's not what they're asking for. We just put it in a way that makes sense from a business perspective.
Nice. I want to gear shift to people. When you founded Omni in 2021, did you have a thought process then about the type of culture that you wanted to instill in the company, or were you just kind of purely focused on shipping product at that time and culture became a later priority?
Interesting. I would say yes and no. I think first of all, I think managing people in finance back then was very different, and in a larger company is very different than being a founder and managing a team. So it's very new to me as a concept. I think I didn't think a lot, at the time when we were hiring, but I know all along the way that I know what kind of people I want. So I want people who actually, focus a lot on the substance, can execute well, have the motivation. So these have always been criteria that I look for in interview. And eventually I think that culture just mold, in the organization over time. So I'm very glad with how the team has shaped up and, the personality and the caliber of people that we have, but it's not a deliberate process. It's just that I'm trying to find people that I would enjoy working with, and that's how we get the team.
Maybe just diving a little bit deeper into that. You've gone through, I imagine, hires that you're so glad you made and hires that maybe haven't yielded in the company. What's been the single attribute or attributes that have been the predictor of success, and how's that shaped your approach to recruiting over time?
I think, one term that I use internally is a spark. So when we look for people, we actually wanted to really see if they have that spark, that sharpness that, when you talk to them, you feel like, oh, they get it and they can execute something. It's not something that you can quantify, but it's just from talking to people that you see whether that person has that, that sharpness, in talking to them. So that's probably what we look for. And I think as long as we see that in the person and the motivation checks out, then I think usually they would be a pretty good hire.
Looking on LinkedIn again, when I was doing the research, it looks as if you've got somewhat of a distributed workforce. Was that kind of a key criteria at the start that you wanted to build out within Omni? And I guess, how do you manage a distributed workforce?
Sure. I think yes and no. So I would say part of the business require a distributed workforce. We have customers around the region. We want to have local support, local, know-how in a lot of those markets. So I think that's where that is coming from. I think one mistake, very honestly, that I have made is that the team is probably a bit too distributed. So we have team members, one or two team members in the country, and that make it hard for us to do anything, from employee engagement, organization perspective, that they will always be, somewhere out there. And that is not something that I would have wanted to. So probably if I were to redo it, I would say I would probably find a few hubs that I would want to hire from. But I think I really like the team that we have so far, and just you just let it be, and just so even like nowadays when we're hiring talent, like we just post a job post and just see wherever people apply, and if they are good talent, we just try to hire them.
I guess the second question on that is, though, like, how do you retain that talent? Right? Like, I've had a look and you've got some pretty exceptional people at Omni. How do you ensure they stay there?
Sure. I guess motivation probably coming from them is still a big part to it. I think I have some very good managers, BU leads in the company, so I trust them in managing their own team. I think personally, I'm very hands-on involved in this. I work pretty long hours in the company as well. So I think people also see that, it's not just them, but like the whole company has that culture that we want to really get something. And I'm always very transparent in sharing, the progress of the company. So like, in town halls and all that, I do share, the challenge that we are going through, what are we seeing in the market right now, what is the goal for us in this year, next year, and so on. So I think people understand how what they are doing, is going to translate into the overall organization success. And when they see that there's actually traction, when they see that people are, signing up, that's where, I think people get the satisfaction from. Yep.
We want to touch on fundraising a little bit, but I do want to sort of talk a little bit about the generation of founders that you're in, right? So, you sort of started your journey coming out of COVID, right? And I guess there's a whole wave of entrepreneurs that you sort of hear about quietly quitting, right? Maybe things haven't yielded as quickly as they thought, the market's harder. And, given your background wasn't in HR tech specifically, were there moments in the first 12, 18 months where you were like, what have I done? That the market's changing. I thought it was going to be about onboarding. It's now about offboarding. Like, were there those nights where you sat there and thought, hang on, am I really going to build this? Like, I think you guys have broken through now and it's pretty obvious you're going to build something really special. But, let's go back to that first 12 months. Like, were you sort of up at night going, what have I done?
For sure. In fact, I would say even quite recently, I actually have been asking myself that question as well. I mean, the case recently was that I know our team is going through a lot of stress. Like, people are very stretched in trying to build so many things and trying to, keep running as quickly as we can. And sometimes I'll be like, why do we have to go through such a hard, journey in doing this? So I have that element as well. And I know, for us as a company, as a startup, our resources are still very limited. I cannot give everything that I want, that my team wants, right? So how do we balance that? How do we balance the unconfidence in, we have customers who tell us that, they need this feature, today, and we just cannot do it for them. So a lot of those, very hard conversations is still ongoing, and that actually still makes me, a lot of time doubting, why do I put everyone into such a situation? So I think that definitely comes out a lot. Early days for sure. I think, our traction has been very, very slow in the first, probably 1-2 years. A lot of doubt on ourselves. I would say, in a way, I was probably a bit too stubborn. I was like, let's not give up. Let's just keep doing it. And I think I learned so much in this process. I was like, even if it eventually fail, I would not regret any day that I spent in building this. So that's probably why I feel like, let's just keep going and see how far we can go. And then eventually, I think there are certain success that we have made. There's still a lot of challenge that we are trying to solve. So we're just taking step by step. I don't think we have made it yet. There's still a very long journey ahead of us.
I love that. I mean, just to sort of touch a little bit deeper into that, how do you manage that stress? And what is, you mentioned town halls. What's appropriate to share with the team? How much do you have to turn up and put on the brave face? How have you learned the leadership sort of capability to kind of manage a team. And I think, you guys have done a great job of retaining that talent. So what have you learned over time that's been really helpful in that respect?
Sure. Extremely difficult. I know, like in the early days, we were being a bit too positive in town halls. And then people would be like, oh, like, I think when we were hitting like 100K ARR, people were like, yeah, like we're a great company. But, like, especially for a lot of teams who are, not coming from a business context, they don't understand, they cannot quantify those.
Yeah.
So when they hear the numbers, how do they interpret? I think there's a lot of, those that we kind of gone through and be like, oh, actually, if I say this is the perception from the team. So I think like nowadays, it's just that, I think I'm very on the ground. I'm very approachable within the team. Like anyone can just, message me and talk about something. So I just hope to have that culture, being so open in the company. I know, like, recently when we announced our fundraising, I spent like probably 15 minutes, in our year-end meeting, be like, there's still a lot of challenge ahead. These are things that we are solving. Our milestone for next year is this and that. So I hope the team can see and, can get the reward that, we have achieved something, but they also know that, the bigger picture is still out there and we still have to achieve a lot more. So it's not easy to manage. I think probably I would say in a town hall or in any public settings, we have to be positive enough so that people can see, the promised, development of the company. But I just always have to tell them, that, we are not there yet. And I think I'm not lying to them. I think it's really the case, in the startup that we are going through this.
Makes sense.
I want to shift to fundraising. It's always a hot topic for founders that are listening. Did you have a process in that first round that you raised? Because we speak to some founders and you can tell that, and they'll openly say that they were kind of winging it. I just suspect, given your background, you actually had somewhat of a process. Do you want to maybe talk through that?
Sure. I think I definitely went through it a lot in the first round. I think coming from a finance background gave me some advantage. I think I know what investors are looking for. I know how to craft that investment story, and I believe in everything I said is true that we are building towards. But I think I have never been in a very early stage investment, so I don't know what raising, in a safe round or seed round was like. And being on that other side of the table is just so much harder, to be honest. Like when you receive the first term sheet, how do you negotiate that? Like probably that was your only term sheet. And how do you maybe still try to to stay strong and try to
create pressure,
negotiate terms. So I think those are really hard. I'm very grateful that I have some really good friends from finance, who are more in the VC space, and they have taught me a few things in this process. But I think it's just really learn as we go. I think as an early stage founder or as an early stage company doing the first round of fundraising, I would say, try to showcase what that potential of the company can be. I think investors, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think investors want to see a really big company that can be built in that category. And if you can show that path and show the traction to it, I think that's probably the most important. And, I think find investors that you like to work with, find investors that will be supportive to you, with you, during, that period of the company. I think that's probably the most important. And a lot of the other things, they can be optimized, but, that's probably not the key factors.
Did you get much pushback? As Ben mentioned earlier in the show, it was, if you look at that space and you didn't go a little bit deeper, you could easily think, oh, okay, this is a very busy area. Did you get that sort of pushback from investors, or did some investors not truly get it?
For sure. I mean, it's a very competitive space, and yeah, for sure. I think we definitely have a lot of pushback. I think it's always about finding people that believe in what you do and proving the tractions, proving like what we have done that we can really build something. I think in my specific case, I have certain ways how I would frame that question to show them, if what does it mean if I want to do X million of revenue? And if that, what is the potential of the company? So that's probably what I want to demonstrate. But for me, it's also I think I want to focus a lot more on fundamental. So I just believe that, if we do what we do well, and over time people would have heard of us. And I believe that we can build, a decent sized company over time. Yeah.
And how do you think about, you've obviously said, get investors that, understand what you're building, you want to partner with on the journey. Is there any other advice that you would give to early stage founders listening on selecting the right investors to join you?
I think, selecting the right investors who understand the space. I think investors, to be very, to be fully honest, I think can only help with a certain, degree of things. But I think within that scope,
we won't take offense.
Yeah. No, I think I love investors who have a founder background, who are very helpful in like providing intros, know-hows, understand the period, of a company that has gone through. For example, I think you guys as a B2B expert, you guys have seen a lot of SaaS company building in different part of the world, and understand, that journey, understand like, what metrics to look at, like how do we know whether it's still too early to judge a company. I think those are probably like important things that I hope, that I think is important in the investor, cap table. Yeah, I think that's probably, is I would say the most important part, and having investors who understand and, be with you along the journey. Yeah.
I think one of the things that you guys did a really good job of early on was being steadfast in the idea that we needed to build a product that was at least going to be good enough to sell capably, because it is a more mature segment, right? So going out to your point and selling something before it was ready, you wish you had started marketing earlier, but really the product may not have been ready for prime time. How did you manage to balance that against the expectations of most investors, which is we want to see things go up and to the right? I think you've been absolutely validated over time that decision's been the right one, and you're seeing that inflection come through. But that's not always easy to do. That's not.
I would say like we have some really difficult times, along the journey. Just really have to find investors who can understand and just, to stay with you. I think for me as a founder as well, like probably a lot of founders who have seen what we have done in the first 2 years would have probably given up, be like, there's no traction. But I think for us, it's like we do believe that we are onto something. And then there's things that translate into numbers. There are things that don't translate, but just from day to day, we see that, people really see the potential in what we do. And we just tell ourselves that, let's just keep doing this, and we can see eventually the light at the end of the tunnel. Yeah.
As we start to wrap up here, I just want to get your views on this kind of wider space, HR tech within Asia, and then, your forward projection of how you see Omni fitting into that picture, say in the next 5-10 years.
Sure. I think HR tech in general is going through a lot of, changes, evolution. AI aside, we can talk about AI separately, but I think AI aside, people are increasingly seeing, so like I always say, like there are probably 3 phases of HR tech. The first phase is just digitizing information, like putting things from Excel or paper into the system. The second phase is when people start thinking about an all-in-one HR system, which is like end-to-end, and that's probably where we are at. And I think the third phase that people are moving to now is that they see HR software as an employee cloud. They see this being the interconnected platform for everything else, connected. And I do believe that's the future of companies with software adoption getting more and more around the world, having new category of system software that are emerging, having something that is really connected beyond HR functions into other employee management functions. I see that as being the potential, the future of HR tech. And essentially, I think anyone who is not moving towards the second and third stage fast enough eventually would become the incumbents over time.
You gave me the layup, so I'm going to go for it. AI. So what's your views with AI? Is it, collaboration with Omni? Is it challenging for Omni? Is there tailwinds, headwinds?
Sure. I think I think with AI, there would be new categories of, HR tech or just tech in general that would be built. Internally, we want to build AI as well. But I think being in Asia, what we notice is that that's not the main focus of a lot of companies right now. And I think we also, in a system, there's a lot of hygiene factors that we just have to keep building as well. So that's probably why we haven't really go deep into building AI first right now. That being said, I believe that where we were positioned as the system of record give us a lot of leverage over time. So if we see that there's once we have covered the hygiene factors, or if we see there's a breakaway idea in AI for HR, that's probably when we would then start diving deeper into AI as well. There can be some more revolutionary change in this landscape as well. There's a lot of talks about AI agents and how people can just interact with an agent before logging into a system. That could be a trend as well. So we are actively monitoring those. Nothing that we have taken right now, given the stage of our company, but definitely something that I think is very interesting to come.
Final question. For the early stage founders that are listening, do you have any war stories, final words of advice to those listening?
I have an advice that was once shared with me from another founder, and it sounds like a very cliche advice, but basically it's hire the right people, hire the best people. But I have a lot of, I feel a lot about this statement over time when I build this. I think I see myself as a good individual contributor, and I think I can execute well. But over time, how can you really build out that team? How can you multiply what you do into different functions, have a lasting impact? And I think sometimes, in the last 6 months, I will also doubt myself, be like, what is my role in my company when there are someone who is a lot more technical than me in every aspect of the company? And I think that's actually is a good situation to be. And that's probably what I would hope, or I would think that every founder should find, is finding someone who is much better than you in every single function. And eventually you can be a coordinator and motivator, but you would not be the person who actually have to do these things.
Great. Brian, thanks for joining us on the first.
Thank you, Brian.
Of course, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.